There is a philosopher sitting alone in a Frankfurt apartment. He is 60 years old. He has a poodle for company and a portrait of Kant on the wall. His great book, his life's work, the thing he was certain would remake the intellectual world, has been out for 30 years and almost nobody has read it. The university ignored it. The critics ignored it. His own mother, herself a published novelist, told him to his face that she thought he was insufferable. And yet Arthur Schopenhauer sits there, utterly convinced that history will vindicate him. The maddening thing is, he was right. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in Danzig in 1788, into the kind of bourgeois mercantile family that expected its sons to sell things, not theorize about the futility of selling things. His father, Heinrich, was a successful merchant. His mother, Johanna, was socially ambitious and intellectually restless. It was not by any measure a warm household. When Arthur was 17, his father died, most likely by suicide, though that was never officially confirmed. Johanna moved to Weimar almost immediately, reinvented herself as a literary hostess, and became something of a celebrity in German cultural circles. Goethe came to her salons. Arthur was not invited to live there permanently. He and his mother had a relationship so poisonous that they eventually stopped speaking entirely and communicated, when they had to, by letter. He would later write, with the bitterness of a man who had clearly thought about it quite a lot, that a person's face is a whole biography. You get the impression he was thinking of a specific face. What all this early suffering gave him, however, was a temperament perfectly calibrated to ask the question he would spend his entire life answering. Why does existence hurt so much? And is there anything at all, to be done about it? Schopenhauer studied philosophy at Göttingen and Berlin, where he encountered the giant who would define and then confine him, Immanuel Kant. Kant had argued, roughly speaking, that reality as it truly is lies permanently beyond human perception. We can only ever know the world as it appears to us, filtered through the structures of our own minds. Schopenhauer absorbed this, turned it over, and asked, yes, but what is actually out there, underneath all that filtering? His answer was singular, strange, and deeply unsettling. He called it the will, not a will in the sense of a person having intentions, something more fundamental and far less comforting, a blind, purposeless, striving force that underlies all of existence. The rock rolling downhill is the will. The flower turning towards sunlight is the will. The man pursuing a woman, the empire expanding its borders, the merchant chasing one more deal, all of it, the same mindless, insatiable drive, expressing itself through a million different forms. And here is where Schopenhauer becomes genuinely uncomfortable to read. He argues that this striving has no final destination. There is no point at which the will is satisfied. You want a thing, you get it, and almost immediately the wanting returns in a new shape. Human life, he writes in The World as Will and Representation, oscillates like a pendulum between pain and boredom. When we don't have what we want, we suffer. When we do, we are simply bored until we want something else. He published this in 1818. He was 30 years old. He was absolutely certain it would detonate the philosophical world. It did not. The failure of the first edition of The World as Will and Representation is one of the more darkly comic episodes in intellectual history. Schopenhauer arranged for it to be published at a reputable firm. He then, in an act of spectacular tactical misjudgment, scheduled his lectures at the University of Berlin at exactly the same time as Hegel, who was, at that moment, the most celebrated philosopher in Germany, arguably the most celebrated philosopher in the world. Schopenhauer detested Hegel. He called him a charlatan, a windbag, a purveyor of deliberately obscure nonsense designed to flatter professors. Whether or not he was right about that, and historians of philosophy still argue about it, the practical result was that his lectures drew almost no students, his books sold almost no copies, and Hegel's reputation continued to soar. The publisher eventually disposed of the remaining stock of The World as Will and Representation as waste paper. Schopenhauer retreated. He spent years in Italy. He taught briefly, failed again to find an audience, and eventually settled in Frankfurt, where he would live for the last 27 years of his life, in a succession of rented rooms, eating his meals at the same table in the same restaurant every day, taking his daily walk with his poodle, a sequence of poodles, in fact, each one named Atma, which in Sanskrit means the world soul, and writing. He revised and expanded the book. He published essays. He simply kept going, with a stubbornness that is either admirable or alarming, depending on your own relationship with rejection. He told anyone who would listen that posterity would understand. Privately, in notebooks, he wrote with rather more anguish. He described himself as a man born out of season, arriving before the world was ready for him. Here is the part of the story that Schopenhauer had always believed in, and that you are perhaps finding it hard to believe in on his behalf. It actually happened. In 1851, when he was 63 years old, he published a collection of shorter essays called Parerga and Paralipomena, a Greek title meaning, roughly, appendices and omissions, which was about as commercially savvy as calling an album songs I didn't think were good enough. And yet those essays, lighter and more accessible than the dense main work, finally landed. Reviews appeared. Enthusiastic ones. A philosopher named John Oxenford wrote a piece in the Westminster Review in 1853 titled Iconoclasm in German Philosophy, which introduced Schopenhauer to English-speaking readers and created a sensation. Within a few years, the man who had spent 3 decades in intellectual exile was famous across Europe. Students began making pilgrimages to Frankfurt to meet him. Portraits were commissioned. By the time he died in 1860, at the age of 72, eating breakfast alone at his usual restaurant table, even fame didn't change his habits much. He was one of the most discussed thinkers in the world. The second edition of The World as Will and Representation, published in 1844 with his extensive revisions, began selling steadily. The third edition followed him to the grave and beyond. He had been right. Posterity had come. It had just taken the better part of a lifetime to arrive at the door. In 1865, 5 years after Schopenhauer's death, a 21-year-old Friedrich Nietzsche walked into a second-hand bookshop in Leipzig and, by his own account, picked up a copy of The World as Will and Representation more or less on impulse. What he experienced reading it was close to what we would now call a crisis of the self. He wrote in a letter that he had found a mirror in which the world, life, and his own mind were reflected with frightful grandeur. He read it for 2 weeks almost without pause. He described going to bed at 2 in the morning, exhausted and disturbed. Schopenhauer's pessimism, the will, the endless futile striving, the suffering baked into the structure of existence, hit the young Nietzsche with the force of something he already half knew but hadn't been able to name. What happened next is one of the great conversations across death in Western philosophy. Nietzsche would spend the rest of his intellectual life arguing with Schopenhauer. First he worshipped him, then he disagreed with him, then he disagreed with him violently and wrote some of his most brilliant pages precisely by pushing off against everything Schopenhauer had concluded. He accepted the diagnosis. Yes, existence is suffering. Yes, the will is real, but he rejected the prescription. Schopenhauer's answer had been withdrawal, aesthetic contemplation, a kind of philosophical quietism. Nietzsche's answer, forged in direct response, was to say, no, you affirm it. You say yes to all of it, the suffering and the joy alike. Without Schopenhauer's pessimism, there is no Nietzsche's affirmation. The bridge between them is one of the most consequential intellectual inheritances in modern thought. Nietzsche was not the only one. The reach of Schopenhauer's ideas in the second half of the 19th century was remarkable, and it crossed disciplines in a way that purely academic philosophy almost never does. Richard Wagner, the composer, was a devoted reader. Wagner's concept of music as the purest and most direct expression of inner truth, the thing that bypasses intellect and speaks straight to the will, in Schopenhauer's sense, is lifted almost directly from The World as Will and Representation. Schopenhauer had argued that music occupies a unique position among the arts because it doesn't represent the world, it expresses the will itself. Wagner read this and recognized, with the immodesty of genius, that he was already doing exactly that. Tristan und Isolde, that cathedral of longing and dissolution, is suffused with Schopenhauerian feeling, the idea that individual desire is a form of illusion, that the only escape from the will is to be absorbed back into something larger. Later, Sigmund Freud would develop his concept of the unconscious, the blind drives operating beneath rational thought, and acknowledge, at least privately, a debt to Schopenhauer's will. The will, in Schopenhauer's system, is not conscious. It does not have intentions, it simply drives. That is a remarkably close anticipation of what Freud would call the id. Schopenhauer, writing in 1818, had sketched the architecture of the unconscious half a century before psychoanalysis gave it a clinical name. He never met Freud, of course. He never met Wagner either, despite Wagner's attempts to arrange an introduction. Schopenhauer, by then famous and elderly, declined. He was, to the end, exactly as unsociable as he appears. So what is it, exactly, that keeps the world as will and representation on university syllabi and in bookshops a full 2 centuries after it was written? It is, on the face of it, a dense and demanding text. The first book deals with epistemology, how we know things. The second introduces the will. The third is a sustained philosophy of art, with an extraordinary section on music. The fourth, and this is where it gets genuinely strange and genuinely moving, deals with ethics and what Schopenhauer calls the denial of the will to live. It is his answer to his own diagnosis. If existence is suffering, if striving is inherently futile, what is the correct response? He looks at ascetic traditions, Buddhist monks, Christian mystics, Hindu renunciants, and finds in all of them a common insight. The way to step off the wheel of suffering is not to want less. It is to recognize, at some deep level, that the boundary between yourself and others is an illusion. Compassion, genuine compassion, the kind where you feel another person's suffering as your own, is the beginning of ethical life. This is not what you expect from the man who called his mother insufferable and named his dog Atma to remind himself that individual identity is temporary. But the philosophy is more generous than the philosopher. That tension between what the book argues for and how its author actually lived is itself part of what makes it worth reading. It is a book about the limits of the self, written by a man constitutionally incapable of getting outside his own. There is something almost tender about that if you are feeling charitable, and if you are not, it is simply very funny. Here then is the accounting. Arthur Schopenhauer published his masterwork in 1818 and was ignored for over 30 years. He spent that silence not recanting or softening his ideas, but deepening them, revising them, and publishing subsidiary work that would eventually serve as the gateway through which the wider world found its way back to the main text. When recognition came, it came with unusual totality. He did not get a partial vindication or a niche audience. He got Nietzsche, who built one of the most influential bodies of thought in Western philosophy in direct dialogue and direct argument with him. He got Wagner, who used his ideas to reshape what European music could mean. He got, decades later, Freud, who found in the concept of the will a ghostly anticipation of the unconscious. He got Thomas Hardy, who absorbed his pessimism into English fiction. He got Jorge Luis Borges, who read him in Spanish translation and called him a writer of genius. He got, eventually, millions of ordinary readers, people who had no particular interest in academic philosophy, but who picked up his shorter essays and found in them something they recognized. The diagnosis of the pendulum, swinging between desire and boredom, has worn rather well in the age of the notification. Schopenhauer never accumulated great wealth. He inherited modestly from his father, invested conservatively. He was oddly prudent with money, despite everything, and lived on the returns of that inheritance throughout his adult life, neither rich nor poor. His intellectual estate, by contrast, was left entirely to whoever picked up the book, and it turned out a remarkable number of people were going to do exactly that. Not because they wanted to be miserable, but because misery, named precisely and thought through carefully, is somehow less miserable than misery that cannot explain itself. That, in the end, is what the book is for. That is what every great dark book is for. So I will ask you the question that Schopenhauer himself would never quite have asked, because he was too proud to invite disagreement. If you had spent 30 years watching the world ignore what you believed was your finest work, would you have kept going? Or would you have decided that the will, in this particular case, had made a fool of you?